إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So continuing with the description of the prayer, the book of Shaykh al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala, we're now on the section talking about the conditions of the prayer. The conditions of the prayer. In Arabic, shurutus salah. Shurutus salah. The shurut or the conditions of the prayer, they are ما يتوقف عليه صحة الصلاة. They are those factors which will determine whether the prayer is correct or not, acceptable or not. Factors where the acceptability of the prayer relies on. If these factors, these conditions are in place, then the prayer can be acceptable. But if these factors, these conditions are absent or missing, then the prayer will not be correct. So it is, the conditions of the prayer are those particular factors that the correctness of the prayer depends on. If they are present, they are correct, they are in place, then the prayer will follow suit. But if these factors are not in place, they are absent, they are missing, then the prayer itself will be absent or missing and not correct. So the conditions of the prayer therefore are needed for the correctness of the prayer. Because a condition, linguistically speaking, is a sign. The word condition or shart in the Arabic language means a sign. As it is mentioned about the signs of the hour, ashratu sa'a. Ashratu sa'a, the signs of the hour. But Islamically or legislatively, here when we talk about a shart, then the definition is ما يلزم من عدمه العدم ولا يلزم من وجوده الوجود. A condition is that which necessitates by its absence, absence. That which necessitates by its absence, absence. Meaning, if, like for example, one of the conditions of the prayer is the right time. You have to pray every prayer in its right time. If the time of that particular prayer was not present, it was absent, then that would dictate the absence of the matter, the issue which is linked to it, which is the prayer. So now, the Fajr prayer. Is the time of the Fajr prayer here now? It is not. Therefore, the Fajr prayer is absent. The absence of the condition dictates the absence of the result. That is what a condition is. Something whereby the absence of it dictates the absence of the outcome. So now the absence of the Fajr prayer time therefore means the absence of the Fajr prayer. You can't pray Fajr now. So ما يلزم من عدمه العدم. Something, if it is missing, it is absent, then the outcome must by definition also be absent. The second part though, ولا يلزم من وجوده الوجود. And it does not necessitate, if it is present, that the outcome will necessarily be present. That's the second part you should write down, then you'll understand it. It does not necessitate, if it is present, that the outcome will also be present. Meaning, Fajr prayer now, you can pray it, it's approximately maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, the time period from the beginning of the Fajr to the end. So now at 6 a.m. in the morning, or it begins, for example, 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. For example, if the Fajr prayer time began at 5 a.m. and finished at 7 a.m., within that time period, it's 5:30 a.m. Now it's present. The item is present. The time period for Fajr is present. Does that necessitate that you have to be praying right now? The Fajr prayer is there, happening, occurring right now. Doesn't necessitate it, because you might decide to pray at 6:30. So from 5 to 6:30, even though the condition is there, the outcome did not appear until 6:30. So just because the condition is there, it doesn't necessitate that the outcome will be there at that moment, every moment. Slightly complicated, but not too much. So if you look at it again, a condition is something. If it is absent, the outcome must be absent. Meaning, if Fajr time isn't here now, it's absent, then Fajr prayer must be absent. You can't pray it. Dhuhr time is absent, the Dhuhr prayer must be absent. You can't pray it. The time isn't there. But at the same time, if it is present, it doesn't necessitate that the outcome must be present there and then too. Because Fajr time now from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. for example, now it's present. If it's 6 a.m., now that condition is present. Does that mean from 5 a.m. all the way till 7 a.m. you have to be praying the Fajr prayer, a 2-hour prayer? It doesn't. So even though the condition is there now within that time period, it's there. It doesn't necessitate that the outcome will be there throughout that time period. That's the point. That when it's there, it doesn't necessitate that the outcome will be there. Fajr prayer enters at 5 a.m. You might not pray till 6 a.m. or 6:15 a.m. So in that first hour, the outcome wasn't there. Where was the Fajr prayer? You weren't praying, even though the condition was there. So therefore, a condition is something, if it is absent, the outcome will be absent. If it is present, then the outcome does not necessarily have to be present. It doesn't dictate it. It will. It may occur, it will occur, but it doesn't have to occur necessarily at that every moment. In simpler terms, as we said at the beginning, if that is difficult to understand, in simpler terms, as we said at the beginning, a condition is something which is required for the acceptability of the outcome. A condition is something which is required in the prayer for the prayer to be correct, in the simplest terms. So the time period for every particular prayer must be there for the prayer to be correct. Very simply, Fajr time must be in for you to be able to pray Fajr. So very simply, a condition is something which is needed for the acceptability and correctness of the outcome. But in the more detailed explanation, a condition, generally speaking, is something, if it is absent, the outcome will definitely be absent. And if it is present, it doesn't necessitate that the outcome will always be present with it. At some point within the presence, the outcome may be there. Like somebody who's upon wudu. Wudu is a condition of the prayer. Somebody who's now got wudu. Does that mean now that during the time period when they are upon wudu, they are going to be praying throughout that time period until the wudu breaks? It doesn't. The condition is there, they're upon wudu. At some point within that time frame of that condition, they may pray. But it doesn't necessitate that if they're upon wudu, every minute they are upon wudu, they're going to be praying until the wudu breaks. Doesn't mean that. So the condition could be there, but the outcome doesn't necessarily have to be there all the time. So then, moving on to this first condition of the prayer. What is this first condition of the prayer? whereby the accurateness, the correctness, the acceptability of the prayer depends on. The first is, as we just said, the entrance of the time. Dukhulul waqt. And this is from the most important of the conditions of the prayer. That the time for that particular prayer has entered. The time for the prayer has entered. And that's why Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen mentions here now that this particular condition is very important. لهذا يسقط كثير من الواجبات مراعاة للوقت. Many obligations, they are no longer applicable if the time period expires. Time periods for obligations are very important. They are from the most important of the conditions, such that if the time period expires, then many acts of worship, you can't do them then. Hajj comes. If you go beyond the time for Hajj, on the 15th of Dhul Hijjah, you want to fly to Saudi to do Hajj, can you do it? It's gone, the time period is finished. You can't perform Hajj anymore. The time period for that worship has expired. Ramadan, a particular time period has been set. It's not permissible for you to say, I can't be bothered, I don't feel like it, I'm going to miss it. When winter comes, I'll just make them up. The time period for that worship is specified. When the time period for that worship goes, then that obligation is no longer applicable to it. Jum'ah prayer. Somebody comes in after Asr and then decides, I didn't pray today, something happened, this, that, the other, I need to pray my Jum'ah, 2 rak'at. Can he do it? Can't do it. After Asr on Friday, Jum'ah time has finished. It's gone. You can't make any congregation now for Jum'ah. So the times for worship are very important. It is one of the most important factors. وَهَذَا التَّعْبِيرُ. And that's why the Shaykh makes a point here. When we talk about the conditions of the prayer, we should phrase this first condition as that a condition of the prayer is the entry of the time, or the entrance of the time, and not just to say the time. Because sometimes with the prayer, somebody may pray it outside of the time and it's still okay. And those examples will come to, like if somebody oversleeps accidentally and they wake up after sunrise, you can pray your Fajr. So that's why you don't just say one of the conditions of the prayer is the time, because if you phrase it in that way, you say one of the conditions of the prayer is the time. In that case, if somebody woke up after sunrise under whatever excuse, they couldn't pray Fajr. If you say the condition is the time, rather we say the entry of the time. When the time enters for that particular worship, you can do your prayer. And you don't just specify the time, because even after that time, for certain reasons, for legitimate reasons, somebody may pray outside of the time. So here the first condition is the time for the prayer must enter. Dukhulul waqt. What is the evidence for this condition of the prayer? What is the evidence that you can't just pray any prayer at any time during the day? You must pray them in those particular times that have been specified. الدليل على أن دخول الوقت من شرط الصلاة قول الله تعالى إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. Surah An-Nisa in the Quran. Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 103. Surah An-Nisa in the Quran, ayah number 103. This is the proof that the prayer can only be prayed in the specific times that are allocated, except with somebody who has a legitimate reason, as we'll come to. So this ayah says, indeed the prayer is prescribed upon the believers. كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا. The fixed times, the prescribed times. That is what the ayah is telling us. The prayer is upon the believers in the prescribed times. كتابا موقوتا. Therefore the Shaykh says, فَلَا تَصِحُّ الصَّلَاةِ قَبْلَ الْوَقْتِ. Therefore, the prayer is not acceptable if you do it before the time. Right now, if somebody says, after the lesson, we'll pray Fajr now before we go home. Just pray the Fajr now, then you can go home, relax, you don't have to get up in the morning. Not acceptable, because right now it's not the time for Fajr. So if somebody prays a particular prayer before the time enters, then the prayer is not acceptable, it doesn't count. وَلَوْ كَانَ الْإِنسَانُ جَاهِلًا أَوْ نَاسِيًا. The Shaykh says, even if a person did that forgetfully, they forgot that the time hasn't entered yet, they thought it was a particular time, or they forgot, they were ignorant of the ruling, it still doesn't count. You've prayed that prayer without the time of the prayer having started. Therefore, your prayer doesn't count if you pray before the time starts. Because like we said, a condition is, if it's absent, then the outcome will definitely be absent. So if the time hasn't started yet for Fajr, that condition is absent. Therefore the outcome is absent. You can't pray Fajr yet. Dhuhr time hasn't started, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, you can't pray a Dhuhr yet. So if the time hasn't entered, then you cannot pray that prayer and it is not correct. If the time finishes, then again the same. You can't pray that prayer afterwards if you've left it on purpose. The scholars, they say there is no qada like that. But if somebody has a legitimate reason, then that is permissible, and we'll come to those later. Firstly, therefore, now to understand what are exactly the times of the 5 prayers in that case. If this is a condition of the prayer, that you can only pray your 5 prayers in their allocated times when the time begins, then what are the times for the 5 prayers? So to begin with, the Fajr prayer. When does the time of Fajr begin in the morning? The true dawn. The true dawn. Therefore indicating that there is a false dawn. So what is the false dawn and what is the true dawn?
The false one, the first white, the first light that you see, the white line, like a column, and then there's another one that comes after that. That's the true dawn.
There's a darkness after the first one. It turns dark and then the true one comes.
So the scholars have mentioned, in the morning, or firstly at night, it's dark, pitch black. Darkness in the night. Then, in the morning, when the light appears, when it first appears, the scholars, they mention in the books of fiqh, in accordance to the narrations, when that light first appears, it appears in a vertical manner, that it appears coming straight up into the sky. Here in this country, very difficult to tell these things, but this is the reality of how it occurs. When the light first appears in the morning, it will appear in a vertical manner going up into the sky. There are some narrations in the Sunnah how it mentions like the whiteness of the tail of the fox, that it goes up into the sky in a vertical manner. When that light appears, it is not the time for Fajr. That is known as the false dawn. Because after that light appears in that vertical manner, after a short time, that light disappears and it becomes pitch black again. So that light, when it came out in that vertical way upwards, it was the false dawn. It appears that maybe the sun is about to rise. It appears light is coming. Maybe that's the time. But it is not. That is the false dawn when the light comes out in that way. Because after that it goes again. It disappears and it becomes dark. Pitch black once again. And that's why the narrations, they mention that when you see that, or when this occurs, when the first adhan is made in the morning, that is not the time when you have to stop eating. That is not the time when you can start praying Fajr. That is the false dawn yet. And that is the first adhan that was made prior to the second adhan, which is made before the time of the actual Fajr. So that is the false dawn. What is the true dawn then? How do you distinguish?
When it's spread.
The true dawn, after this false dawn has occurred and it's gone dark again, it's disappeared, Then the fuqaha, they mention the light when it appears the second time, it will appear not upwards in the sky, it will appear flat across the horizon, coming out flat across the horizon, rather than the first time when it was shooting up into the sky. This time it will come out flat across the horizon. That light which comes out horizontally flat across the horizon, the scholars, they mention, this is now the true Fajr. That is the true dawn. And that is what indicates the beginning of the Fajr prayer time. When that light appears horizontally across the horizon. That is now the time for the one who is fasting, have to stop eating. That is the time for the one who is praying Fajr, you can now pray Fajr. That is the true dawn. Here Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen says, Waqtul Fajr, the time for Fajr. Min tulu'il Fajr, from the rising of the Fajr, and that is talking about that true Fajr, ila an tatla' ash-shams. So now we've established when the time begins. How long does it carry on till? When can you carry on praying Fajr till?
Sunrise.
Till sunrise. Ila an tatla' ash-shams, until the sunrise actually occurs, when it starts. So initially just that light comes out upwards in the sky. False dawn. That disappears, it becomes dark again. Then the light comes out horizontally across the horizon. That is the true dawn. Fajr time has begun. It carries on up until the sun actually begins to rise. When the sun actually appears, it starts to rise, Fajr time has ended. So that is the Fajr time. From the true dawn, horizontally, up until when the sun actually starts to rise. فَالْأُفُقْ مُظْلِمْ كُلَّ اللَّيْلِ. The Shaykh says the horizon will be in darkness all of the night. فَإِذَا دَنَتِ الشَّمْسِ مِنَ النَّاحِيَةِ الشَّرْقِيَّةِ مِنَ الْأُفُقِ بَانَ نُورُ الشَّمْسِ. Then from the eastern side in the morning when the sun comes close, it's about to rise, some light will appear. فإذا تبين في الأفق ممتدا من الشمال إلى الجنوب فهذا دخول وقت صلاة العصر. So if you see it then spread out across north to south, all across the horizon, that is then the time for the beginning of Fajr. والفرق بين طلوع الفجر وطلوع الشمس يتراوح بين ساعة وربع وساعة ونصف حسب اختلاف الفصول. And the Shaykh says the time period, typically as an example, from when that true dawn occurs up until when the sun actually begins to rise up over the horizon, is approximately somewhere in the region of an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 30 minutes, as an example. Roughly about that time. So that would be the amount of time in between those where Fajr prayer is acceptable, and that is the time for the praying of the Fajr prayer. The second prayer, Dhuhr. When does the time of Dhuhr begin? When the object is equal to the shadow, that's when Dhuhr begins.
The sun is at its peak.
When there's no shadow.
So, here the Shaykh says, وقت الظهر من زوال الشمس إلى أن يصير ظل كل شيء مثله زائدا على فيء الزوال. إذا طلعت الشمس ونسبت شيئا شاخصا كالعصا أو غيره صار له ظل. هذا الظل كلما ارتفعت الشمس نقص حتى يقف. فإذا انتهى وبدأ يزيد فحينئذ زالت الشمس. So, in the morning, the sun rises from the east. Therefore, if you were to put an object outside, the shadow would be which direction? The west. The sun is rising from the east, the shadow of any given object will be down towards the west. The sun rises and rises and rises until it is right in the peak of the sky. The middle of the sky at the peak, at the highest point. At that moment, the shadow of the object will be directly underneath it. There is nothing around the sides of it. The sun is directly above it at the peak of the sky. Therefore, there is no real shadow anywhere, it's directly under it. If you pick it up, you'll see the shadow directly under the object. Then, After that, when the sun moves across from the middle point of the day, the shadow will now start to appear on the eastern side of the object, because the sun has now dropped into the western side. As soon as that occurs, as soon as the sun enters into the western side, and therefore the shadow of the object begins on the eastern side of it, that is the time for dhuhr beginning. As soon as that object has its shadow starting on that eastern side now, because the sun has moved from the middle of the sky, from the peak to the west, it's going down now. The moment it does that, the shadow will appear on the eastern side. That is the beginning of the time for dhuhr. The beginning of the time for dhuhr is not when the sun is directly at the peak and the shadow is directly under. That is actually a forbidden time. The time for the dhuhr begins when the sun moves down. It begins to head into the western side, and therefore the shadow begins to appear on the eastern side. Now dhuhr has begun. And where does it continue till? Till the shadow is equal to that object. So the shadow increases as the sun moves further and further, until the shadow of the object is equal to the object itself. The shadow of the object is the same length, that's 30 centimeters. The shadow is 30 centimeters. It's equal. That is the end of the time for dhuhr. That is then the end of the time for the dhuhr prayer. Shaykh Al-Uthaymin gives an example. He says, اجعل علامة من بدء زيادته فإذا امتد الظل من هذه العلامة إلى رأسه بمقدار الشاخص فقد خرج وقت الظهر. The Shaykh says, if you were to make a line, make some sort of signal or some sort of sign, make a mark, and then when the shadow increases and increases and increases until it's at the level of that object, the mark is equal to the size of the object. Now when it goes beyond that, dhuhr time is finished. Up until the equality of it, that is the dhuhr time. So then when does asr time begin? When dhuhr finishes. Therefore, when the object has a shadow equal to it, or it just goes beyond and greater than equal to it, that is now end of dhuhr and asr has begun. So from that point, when the shadow is equal to the object, dhuhr now ends, asr now begins. And when does asr continue till?
The shadow's twice the length of the object.
When the shadow is twice the length of the object, asr finishes. That's one opinion so far. You're saying when maghrib enters, which is sunset. So you're saying from the moment the shadow is equal to itself, now dhuhr ends, asr begins, and it carries on till sunset. You're saying till it's double the shadow?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
When the colour changes to sort of dark orange, sort of yellow.
When the color changes to an orange yellow in the sky.
No, the sun itself.
The sun itself. So 3 opinions so far. One opinion says that it is when the shadow becomes double the length of the object, asr time ends. Another opinion here says all the way until the sun actually disappears, it sets. Now asr finished. Another opinion says as the sun keeps going down and down and down, you notice when it's close to sunset, it becomes a very orangey, reddy color. So one brother saying that's when asr time ends. So that's before it actually sets. Anyone else?
What they say is when the sun changes colour, after it's for necessity to go to the asr, but it finishes and the sun changes goldish colour.
There are 2 opinions of the scholars. One opinion says that asr time continues up until sunset. Some of the scholars, they say openly like that it continues up until sunset. However, there is another statement of the scholars regarding this issue, which is that the time of asr ends when the sun becomes that orangey, reddy, hazy color, i.e. when it's close to sunset, prior to sunset, even in this country in the summer days, you see when it's near to sunset, that the sun becomes an orange, red, misty kind of color. The scholars, they say at that point when the sun becomes that type of color, then Asr time has ended. Asr time has ended at that point. And this is before sunset. The sun is there, you can see it. But it's at the almost going to sunset. But it's not set yet. It's just going to sunset. It's red, orange, that color, it becomes near to sunset. They say Asr is finished there. Not all the way until it actually sets. The scholars, they say, after that point, when it becomes that reddy, orangey color, it's close to setting, it's down in the horizon. After that point, they say it's the time of waqtul durura, necessity. If somebody had not prayed prior to that, in the actual time which was up to the redness point, then you can still pray your prayer. Asr can still be prayed and it will be acceptable up until sunset. But that is only in necessity. The actual time is from the shadow being equal up until when the sun is near to sunset. It becomes that orangey, reddy, hazy color. That's Asr time ended. After that point, up until actual sunset, then that time period at the end is only necessity. You don't leave your Asr prayer till then on choice. That is only necessity. Something occurs, whatever the situation, you could pray in that time if necessity led to it, and it would be acceptable. But otherwise, you need to pray the prayer before it becomes the reddy, orangey, hazy color, which is before it actually sets. The sun is there, you can see it. That is what the scholars mention regarding the Asr prayer. So here the Shaykh says, the time for Asr is من خروج وقت الظهر إلى أن تصفر الشمس. From after when Dhuhr time ends, when the shadow of the object is equal to it, Asr begins, up until أن تصفر الشمس. The sun becomes that orangey, yellowy, hazy color. أي تكون صفراء وهذا يختلف في الشتاء والصيف قد تصفر قبل الغروب ساعة أو قبل الغروب أقل حسب الأوقات. So until the sun becomes that yellowy color, that very misty, yellowy, orangey color. And the Shaykh says this could occur at different times. Don't think that that only occurs just 10 minutes before sunset. The Shaykh mentions here sometimes this could be an hour before actual sunset. Maybe up to an hour before Maghrib time your Asr finishes. It could be sometimes, and sometimes the Shaykh says maybe half an hour before Maghrib, depending on the seasons and how those timings occur. So when it gets near to sunset and it becomes that yellowy, orangey, hazy color, many of the scholars, they say that is the end of Asr time. Beyond that, up until sunset, is the time of necessity. If you hadn't prayed for some reason, legitimate reason, out of necessity you could pray, then it would be acceptable. So the Shaykh says, otherwise, without necessity, لا يجوز أن تؤخر إلى إصفرار الشمس. It is not permissible for you to delay the prayer beyond that yellowness, orangeness, haziness of the sun. To let it get that late and you haven't prayed on purpose without any reason, just delaying it, it is not permissible. Then Maghrib prayer. So Maghrib prayer begins at sunset, after sunset, min ghurub al-shams, up until when? How long can the Maghrib prayer be prayed till? What is the time period of the Maghrib prayer? Until? No, the sun, once the sun has set, that's when it begins. The sun's gone, it's set. Once the sun has set, the Maghrib time begins. When is it carrying on till? How long can you carry on praying Maghrib till?
Up until Isha.
Up until Isha? Excellent answer. But when is Isha then?
Does light remain?
Until?
Does light remain when the light is totally...
Ashafaq al-Ahmar. So, the scholars, they mention Maghrib time begins when the sun sets. After the sun sets, does it instantly become pitch black everywhere?
No.
The sun has set, you will still see in the western side redness, orangeness, yellowness. There'll be light. There will still be light even after the sun has officially set. It's gone, it's set. But there will still be light. It doesn't become pitch black instantly the next minute after sunset. That light remains. That light remains for a period of time. Slowly it starts to disappear. When that light finally completely disappears and it does become pitch black, that's the end of Maghrib. And that could take an hour, could take an hour and a half for the final remnants, what's left of the light after sunset, to finally fade away and disappear. When it finally fades away and that redness in the sky disappears altogether and it becomes black now there's no sign of the sun anywhere. You look around, you can't tell anywhere where the west is anymore. It's gone black everywhere, there's no light anywhere, there's no remains of any sun rays anywhere. Now Maghrib has ended. But when it initially sets, you will have that light left. You will have that light still left when it initially sets. To the extent the Sahaba, it's mentioned, they would pray the Maghrib prayer after sunset. They would pray the Maghrib prayer, and after that they would do what? What's the example given in the hadith? They would shoot an arrow and they would still be able to see where it lands. To be able to shoot an arrow that goes 100 meters, 50 meters and still be able to see where it lands, there must be a significant amount or a substantial amount of light. They said we could do this after finishing the Maghrib prayer, do that, and we would still be able to see where it lands. This therefore indicates after sunset it doesn't become pitch black, so there will be light left over. That light slowly fades away and disappears. When it completely disappears, Ash-Shafaq al-Ahmar, the redness in the horizon, it disappears altogether. Maghrib time has ended. So that could be an hour, could be an hour and a half, depending. That can be a certain amount of time. That is the time for Maghrib. So here the Shaykh says, من غروب الشمس إلى مغيب الشفق الأحمر لقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقت صلاة المغرب ما لم يغب الشفق. The hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, the time of the Maghrib prayer is as long as that redness in the sky doesn't disappear. As long as it hasn't disappeared, Maghrib time is in. When it's gone, Maghrib time has ended. والمراد بالشفق هنا الشفق الأحمر لا الشفق الأبيض وهذا لا يعرف إلا إذا خرج الإنسان خارج البلد ونظر إلى المغرب فإذا زالت الحمرة فقد خرج وقت المغرب ودخل وقت العشاء. The Shaykh says that type of thing really you can't tell unless you go out of the city. With the city and the lights and everything which comes on, it's very difficult to tell. But the Shaykh says if you go out somewhere and you look at the west where the sun has gone down, you'll see that redness which remains. Even in the UK now, you look over certain sections where there are hills and mountains in a countryside, you can see that redness after the sun disappears. So once that redness completely goes, the Maghrib time has ended, and therefore Isha time begins then. When that redness disappears, Isha time then begins. And how long does Isha time continue till?
The middle of the night.
Half of the night?
Halfway between Fajr.
Middle of the night?
Halfway between Fajr. Divided by 2.
Halfway between Fajr?
If you, the 6 hours and divided by 2 and add on.
So half of the night? 2/3 of the night. So up until the last third of the night starts. Just before the last third of the night starts, you can carry on praying. And others are saying not up to that far, only up to half. Correct, they are the two opinions of the scholars. Some scholars mention Isha time continues up until half of the night. Others they say it can be prayed up until 2/3 of the night. So here the Shaykh mentions من مغيب الشفق الأحمر إلى نصف الليل. Shaykh al-Uthaymeen mentions from the disappearance of the redness in the sky, Isha begins up until half of the night. How do you determine what half of the night is? How are you going to work out where half of the night is? Maghrib to Fajr. So here the Shaykh says وكيفية ذلك أن تنظر ما بين غروب الشمس وطلوع الفجر فتأخذ نصفه. From the time of Maghrib, sunset, up until the time of Fajr, whatever the hours are, 8 hours, 10 hours. If it's 8 hours, for example, take half of that, 4 hours. So if Fajr is at 4 a.m. and Isha began at not the Maghrib began at 8 p.m., then half of the night is midnight exactly. So you could pray your Isha up until midnight. Here then the Shaykh says, وَهَذَا هُوَ نِصْفُ اللَّيْلِ فَإِذَا قُلْنَا إِنَّ اللَّيْلَ مِنْ غُرُوبِ الشَّمْسِ إِلَى أَذَانِ الْفَجْرِ 10 ساعات. The Shaykh gives an example of 10 hours. If sunset up until Fajr Adhan, the entrance of Fajr time, is 10 hours, يَكُونُ نِصْفُهُ 5 ساعات. Then half of that is 5 hours. So if Maghrib sunset was 7 p.m. and Fajr, the time of Fajr begins at 5 a.m. The horizontal true dawn, 5 a.m. Therefore, the middle of the night is up to midnight, 5 hours. So you could pray your Isha up until midnight. That would be half of the night. And working it out on the thirds, then you do your maths for the thirds, and the 2/3 of the hours continues, or the night, the prayer can be prayed up until 2/3. The Shaykh's example, he says, if the sun goes down at 6 p.m., if the sun goes down at 6 p.m. and the night is 10 hours long, so the sun goes down at 6 p.m. and the night is 10 hours long, Fajr is therefore 4 a.m. You can pray Isha till when? 11 p.m. in that case. So you have to work out the times, and then half of that is where you can pray your Isha up until. Again, some of the scholars, they say, it is the opinion of some of the scholars, that after that half then, beyond half of the night, up until Fajr actually begins, is the time of necessity. If for some reason you weren't able, something happened, emergency, whatever the situation, you were not able to pray before that for some legitimate reason, you could still pray your Isha prayer beyond the middle of the night, but that is only out of necessity. You don't choose to do that. You don't relax doing whatever you're doing and not bother until after the middle of the night, then you go and pray. Not out of choice, only out of necessity if it occurred. So again the Shaykh says, this will depend, where the middle of the night is, will depend on the seasons, summer, winter, etc. When that time starts of sunset, and when the time of Fajr begins, sometime it's short, sometime it's long. So that will depend on the timings of the seasons. That's therefore the 5 prayers. The times of the 5 prayers. So, time for Fajr is when then? The true dawn, which is? When the light spreads horizontally. Prior to that there is the false dawn, which is? When it comes out vertically. And after that it actually disappears and then comes out horizontally. Fajr time begins. Carries on till? Sunrise. Dhuhr time begins? After the peak of the day. Not at the peak of the day. After the peak of the day, when the sun starts heading down towards the west, and therefore the shadow starts appearing on the east, Dhuhr begins. Carries on till? Same size, shadow equal shadow. That means therefore Dhuhr ends and Asr begins and carries on till the yellowness of the sun. That is the time. Up until after that, from after that till sunset is the time of necessity. Then sunset, Maghrib begins and carries on till the sun rays that are left over, the redness in the sky disappears. When that disappears, Maghrib has gone and Isha has started, and that carries on till half of the night. And some of the scholars have the opinion to a third of the night or 2/3 of the night. And some of them have even mentioned up until all the way till Fajr, but that, as most say, is only out of necessity. Out of necessity it can be prayed beyond that time. Now the issue is, you can see therefore, every prayer isn't a very precise or a short time. Every prayer has a reasonable time. Fajr could be an hour long, it could be an hour and a half. Dhuhr could be a couple of hours. In the summer here, it could be 3-4 hours. Asr could be 3-4 hours long. There are lengthy time periods for these prayers. The question now is then the next issue, when is it best to pray the prayers? At the beginning, as soon as these times enter, or later on in the middle of them, or towards the end of the time? When should the prayers be prayed within those times that are permissible? Within those times, any time is permissible and your prayer is acceptable. But the issue here is, what is better? What is the sunnah? Even though within that time period, any time you pray, it's acceptable and it's done. But what is the sunnah? When should you pray within those time periods? What is mentioned from the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? So then, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, as they say, الأفضل في جميع الصلوات الخمس التقديم إلا العشاء. All of the 5 prayers, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, they should all be prayed at the beginning times, except for the Isha prayer. The Isha, it is better to delay to the later times within its time. But the other 4 prayers, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr and Maghrib, it is the sunnah that they should all be prayed at the beginning time. The time begins for all of those prayers, the prayer should be performed. Except for Isha, then the better thing to do is to delay it if it does not cause burden. And that will come to in detail or mention something regarding it later too. So here, the Shaykh says, بدليل أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حين تأخر ذات ليلة عن صلاة العشاء إلى آخر وقتها خرج وهو يقول لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم أن يصلوها هكذا. With regards to the Isha prayer, it is better to delay it if there is no burden upon the people. One of the proofs for that is the narration of the Prophet ﷺ where he said, on one occasion he came out to lead them in the Isha prayer late, at the end time of Isha. And that night when he came out to lead the prayer and it was at the end time of Isha, late, he said, was it not for the fact that I would burden my ummah, it would be a burden to have to pray at the late time, the late of the night, then I would have. Was it not that it would be a burden, I would have commanded them to pray like this, at the end time for Isha all the time. But it can be a burden, it can be difficulty, so it is not prescribed as an obligation to do that. But for the Isha prayer, it is mentioned to delay if possible, without difficulty. But the other 4 prayers, to pray at the beginning times. So the Shaykh says, لكن لما كان الرجال مطالبين بصلاة الجماعة وكان الناس يصلون صلاة العشاء في أول وقتها لدفع المشقة صار واجبا عليه أن يصلي مع الجماعة في أول الوقت. The Shaykh says, now though people, they are required, men of course are required to pray in the congregation. And people now, the congregations in the masajid, etc., they occur at the beginning time typically. The congregational prayers for Isha are typically in the earlier times to remove the difficulty upon the people, to remove the burden upon the people of having to pray very late into the night. In that case, the Shaykh says, what's better? Pray by yourself later or pray in the congregation at the earlier time? Pray in the congregation at the earlier time. In that case, then the congregation is what you pray upon and it is not delayed. Because nowadays, the Shaykh says, many of the people, they pray the congregations at the early time for Isha to remove the difficulty upon the people of coming late. Then the Shaykh goes on to say, وَبِنَاءً عَلَى ذَلِكَ, therefore, إِذَا كَانَ جَمَاعَ فِي رِحْلَةٍ أو في سفر وقالوا أيهما أحسن أن نؤخر صلاة العشاء أو أن نعجلها. If, however, the Shaykh says in this example now, a group of people were out traveling somewhere. A group of people are out traveling somewhere. There's no congregation, there's no masjid. They're going to pray themselves in the jama'ah, their own jama'ah. So now for them, what's better to do? For them it's better now to delay. They're traveling, they're all able, they have the ability, there's no issue. For them now it's better to delay. Al-afdal al-ta'khir. ولو أن أحدا من الرجال فاتته صلاة العشاء ثم قال هل الأفضل أن يصليها الآن أو أن يؤخرها إلى آخر الوقت قلنا له الأفضل أن تؤخرها إلى آخر الوقت. Another situation, what if a person for some reason ended up missing the congregation? Now afterwards, he comes to the masjid or he's delayed and he comes and the prayer is gone. Should that person now pray his Isha straight away, or should he then decide, I'm able, I've got the ability, I could delay? Should he then choose to delay or pray the prayer instantly? The prayer was at 8 o'clock, he arrives at the masjid at 8:45. Should he pray it there and then, or now should he delay? He can delay now if he wants. He's missed the congregation, whatever's happened, he's missed the congregation. After that now, if he has the ability to delay himself, he can delay. There's narrations mentioned by the companions when they came to the masjid, the congregation was gone. They didn't instantly pray there, they went home, back to their homes and prayed. So it's possible in that scenario, a person ends up for whatever reason, being late for the Isha congregation. Later then, if you have the ability, you can delay and pray later on towards the end of the time. And that would be acceptable too. What about the women? What should the women do when it comes to the Isha prayer? Because them, it's not an obligation to come and pray in the congregation in the masjid anyway. So they are free. When do they pray Isha? What is the recommendation for the women? For the late. Same thing. Recommendation for the women then is that they should pray late if they are able and it is not a difficulty upon them. That needs to be understood. If it is not a difficulty upon them, إِلَّا إِذَا شَقَّ عَلَيْهِنَّ, if it is a difficulty upon them, there are young children, they're going to wake up early, etc., other things to do, the chores, the kids, feeding them, whatever it may be. If it is a difficulty to pray late, and it is more convenient to pray in the earlier time, then that is okay. Only if the woman is free and she has her affairs in order, and she's able to delay and pray later on in the night towards the end of the time, then that is better for the women too. But if it's a difficulty and it's a burden to do that, it's completely acceptable and correct to pray in the early time for the women at home. Therefore the Shaykh says, apart from the Isha prayer, all the other prayers should be prayed at the beginning times. لكن لو قال قائل إن قدمت الصلاة صليت وحدي وإن أخرتها صليت مع الجماعة لأن هناك جماعة يؤخرون فهل أقدم أو أخر. Now the opposite situation. The Sunnah says you should pray these other four prayers at the beginning time, early times. But now you find perhaps that the congregation in the masjid is actually being held later on into the time. Halfway into the time, 3/4 of the way into the time the congregation is being held. So now should you pray yourself at home at the early time as soon as it starts, or delay and go and pray in the congregation even though they aren't fulfilling the sunnah, or they aren't doing it at the earlier time, they're doing it later? Which is better then? Congregation again. Because the congregation, it is an obligation. As for praying the prayer in the early time, that is a sunnah. So there is no contradiction between that. There is one other exception, which is the dhuhr prayer. What is the exception for the dhuhr prayer to not be prayed at the first time, at the early time, and it can be delayed to the end time just before Asr? When it's extremely hot. There are examples. There is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, إِذَا اشْتَدَّ الْحَرِّ فَأَبْرِدُوا بِالصَّلَاةِ فَإِنَّ شِدَّةَ الْحَرِّ مِنْ فَيْحِ جَهَنَّمِ. That if the heat is severe, and that is not something we experience here, but in certain parts of the world, if the heat is severe and at that time of dhuhr, just when the sun has gone past the middle of the day, that time, that next hour or two is the hottest time of the day. When the sun is right up there at the top, that's the hottest time of the day. So if the heat is severe, the hadith says, فَأَبْرِدُوا بِالصَّلَاةِ, then cool yourselves with the prayer. Meaning, delay the dhuhr prayer until the end time. Because when it comes to the end time, now the sun is going down and down, the shadow is almost the same size as itself. The day will now typically become a little bit cooler. The more the sun goes down, the cooler it becomes. But when it's at the top, near the top, it's the hottest. So in this narration it says, if there was severe heat, in that type of scenario, it would be permissible to delay the dhuhr towards its end time, because that would be cooler, slightly cooler than the beginning time. فَإِنَّ شِدَّةَ الْحَرِّ مِنْ فَيْحِ جَهَنَّمْ, because the severity of this heat, it is from the breath of Jahannam, it is from the hellfire, that severity of the heat which it comes from. There is one issue the scholars mention regarding that point of delaying the dhuhr when it is extremely hot. Is that a sunnah, that it is something recommended? If it is hot, it is actually preferable for you to delay? Or is it a rukhsa, meaning that if it's extremely hot, it's still better for you to pray at the beginning time, but it's allowed for you to pray later? Which of the two situations? When it's dhuhr time and it's extremely hot, is the meaning of this narration that it's actually sunnah, recommended in the heat, delay it, pray later? That's better. Or does it mean that if it's extremely hot, you still should pray at the beginning time, but it's allowed if you can't because of the heat to delay? Which of the two? Rukhsa. Rukhsa. So if everybody's saying it's a rukhsa, meaning that you should still pray at the beginning, but it's allowed to delay, Shaykh al-Uthaymeen says here, the scholars have differed over this issue. They've differed over this point, that is it a sunnah to actually delay when it's heated, or is it something which is a rukhsa, meaning you should still pray at the beginning, but it's allowed to pray at the end, not that it's a sunnah or recommended to do that. The scholars, they differed, the Shaykh says, the Shaykh al-Uthaymeen. He says, فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَالَ, some of them they said, إِنَّهُ sunnah, that it is sunnah, it is recommended. If it is hot, you should delay and pray later on. وَعَلَى هَذَا فَيُشْرَعُ الْإِبْرَادُ بِكُلِّ حَالٍ. Then in any situation, even if you say it's extremely hot and boiling, but we have no problem, we can pray, even then you should delay and pray later. That's according to this opinion that says it's a sunnah. So even if you're capable, there's no problem, you can take the heat, you should still delay and pray later on because of the heat. That's an opinion. Some of the scholars, however, say it's a rukhsa only, that it's a permission, not that it's a recommendation or a sunnah to do, it's a permission that you've been given. So in that case, it is for the sake of, or for the permission of, for the need of coolness, because of the severity of the heat and it's difficult upon the people. Not that it's something recommended to delay dhuhr, but because of the heat and the severity and the difficulty, it's allowed to pray later. So some of the scholars take that opinion, and others they take the opinion that it is an actual sunnah. Shaykh al-Uthaymeen says, وَعَمَلُ النَّاسِ الْيَوْمِ عَلَى أَنَّهُ رُخْصَةٌ. The Shaykh says many of the people nowadays, what they take the opinion of and how they behave, and you see this from the congregations in the masajid, is that they take it as a rukhsa only, as a permission, that you're allowed to delay it in the heat. But typically they don't, the Shaykh says. In the mosques, Shaykh talking about Saudi Arabia, of course, that the masajid, typically you won't see that occurring. Even in the heat, they won't delay that dhuhr prayer. الناس الآن لا يؤخرون. People, they don't delay the dhuhr prayer these days. يصلون صلاة الظهر في أول وقتها صيفا وشتاء. People pray the dhuhr prayer at the beginning time, whether it's summer or winter. So typically the Shaykh says that is the practice of the people these days, that they consider it as a permission. That you can do it, but they don't. No, most of the time they do not. They pray at the beginning time, but it's a permission which allows you to do it. If, however, the other opinion was taken, then everybody would be doing it. It would be a recommendation, a sunnah to delay. But the Shaykh says many of the people take it as a permission only, not a recommendation and a sunnah. وهذا بناء على أنه رخصة وأن المقصود بالإبراد الرفق بالناس وأن الناس الآن يقولون إن الرفق بنا أن نقدم صلاة الظهر. The Shaykh says nowadays the people's practice is that they will pray the dhuhr on time at the beginning, even in the heat, because they take the opinion it's a permission to make it easier for you. It's hot, take the permission, delay the prayer when it's a bit cooler, go and pray. But he says nowadays people say, based upon that it's a permission to make it easier for you. People, the Shaykh says these days, say it's actually easier for us to pray Dhuhr at the beginning. To pray Dhuhr at the beginning time, people say that's easier for us. Pray at the beginning time, then you can go and do your affairs and whatever needs to be done. لأننا لو أخرناها وجاء الطلاب من مدارسهم وتغدوا لناموا عن صلاة الظهر. The Shaykh says people these days, they say if we were to delay the Dhuhr prayer, especially the way it is in the hot countries, in Saudi Arabia, those places, that you have the siesta, you have the midday nap, and that is typically around about the Dhuhr time or after Dhuhr. So the Shaykh says people complain here that if we were to delay the Dhuhr prayer closer to Asr time, the people would come home, the kids would come home, and they would take their siesta before Dhuhr now, whereas typically it would be after. They would take it before Dhuhr and then not bother waking up. So the Shaykh says in their situation, people complain that it's not actually, or they make mention of this fact that it's not actually an ease for them. It makes it more difficult for some other people. So, based upon the opinion it's a permission, then there is no issue in that whatsoever. They can pray in the heat, in the severity at the beginning time still. So that is what the Shaykh says that many of the people they do now. They take it as a permission, and therefore rarely do you see that it is actually something done in the mosques, that the congregation is late almost just before Dhuhr time. If the decision is made that in the heat, in the severity, the prayer will be delayed, the Dhuhr prayer will be delayed to a later time, half an hour before Asr, rather than at the beginning time, then in that case, when is the adhan supposed to be done? When are you supposed to make the adhan? Still when the time enters at the beginning, but then don't pray for 2 hours maybe? Or later on, closer to the time when you're actually going to pray? Closer to the time when you're going to pray.
Time, because maybe some people they're going to pray at home.
The Shaykh says, إِذَا أُرِيدَ بِالْإِبْرَادِ بِصَلَاةِ الظُّهْرِ فَإِنَّهُ يُؤَخَّرُ الْأَذَانِ. The adhan is to then be delayed. Because it is mentioned in a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, كُنَّا in Sahih al-Bukhari, كُنَّا مَعَ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم في سفر. We were traveling with the Prophet ﷺ on a journey. We were traveling with the Prophet ﷺ on a journey. فَأَرَادَ الْمُؤَذِّنُ أَنْ يُؤَذِّنُ. The mu'adhin wanted to make the adhan. The time had come. فَقَالَ لَهُ. So he said to him, أَبْرِدْ. That make it cool, meaning delay the prayer until it's cooler. ثُمَّ أَرَادَ أَنْ يُؤَذِّنُ. Then later on the mu'adhin now thought, okay, now is the time to make the adhan. Again he said to him, أبرد, make it cool, i.e. allow it to become cooler. ثُمَّ أَرَادَ أَنْ يُؤَذِّنَ فَقَالَ لَهُ أبرد. Again a third time, said to him, let it cool. حَتَّى سَاوَ الظِّلُّ التُّلُولَ فَقَالَ صلى الله عليه وسلم إِنَّ شِدَّةَ الْحَرِّ مِنْ فَعِهِ جَهَنَّمَ. Until the shadow became similar to it, i.e. right at the end of the Dhuhr time, and then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that this heat is from the hellfire. وهذا يدل على أن الإبراد يتأخر وليس كما يفعله بعض الناس يؤخر الأذان نصف ساعة عن العادة بل لا يبرد حتى يكون قريبا من صلاة العصر. So this indicates, this hadith, that they eventually prayed almost just before Asr time. Just before the shadow was about to become that equal amount, just close to it, that's when they ended up praying Dhuhr. So the Shaykh says the point of this narration, of this permission of making it cool, isn't just to say that normally we pray Dhuhr at 1 p.m. It's extremely hot today, we'll take the permission and pray at 1:30. That isn't the purpose. The Shaykh says coolness will occur at 2:30, 3 o'clock. Later, close to the time of Asr. That is the meaning of delaying that Dhuhr prayer till that point. That's where we'll conclude today. Next week we'll carry on with further details about some of the other prayers, about the Fajr prayer, because there is, you may have noticed, some of the people, they pray Fajr practically when the sun is rising. In some of the masajid, their congregation is practically when it's daylight. And there is some narrations they use for that. But the sunnah is to pray, as we said, at the beginning time. So we'll discuss that issue next week regarding the Fajr prayer, about praying at the beginning time and the narrations for that, and to explain why some people pray so late believing that to be the sunnah and why that is actually a misunderstanding of the narration. So we'll start from that point next week. Inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. You have the workbooks now, so fill in your notes and keep a record of the notes and keep them up every week inshallah.